Today's lecture is going to be about performance art. And I want to start off this lecture with a quote from Harold Rosenblum, who was a famous art critic, teacher, and curator. He says that at a certain moment, the canvas began to appear to one American painter after another as an arena in which to act, rather than as a space in which to reproduce, redesign, analyze, or express an object, actual or imagined. And when he starts talking about the idea of the canvas looking as an arena in which to act, we have to think back to artists such as Jackson Pollock, who takes the canvas off of the wall, off of the easel, puts it onto the ground, and starts creating art by flailing his arms, dripping, splashing paint onto the surface of the canvas. He is an action painter. And for that mark, so is Helen Frankenthaler. These artists create art through what's called the heroic gesture, where they're physically using their body to create art. The next logical extension from this is going to be performance art. The father of performance art is Alan Kaprow, and he gives a lot of credit to both Jackson Pollock and Edgar Degas from the Impressionist movement. The idea that they're breaking down the idea of time and space, that they're removing the idea of the frame surrounding their work. That we know in the image at the left, this ballerina's dress and her arm extend into our world. And the same thing with Pollock's drip paintings. The drips don't stop at the edge of the canvas. They continue on to the floor. It is a transition between the past and the present. So I want to give you a few facts about performance art before we start looking at it. First, it's primarily a conceptual activity, and this is really important. This means that the importance of the work lays with the idea rather than the physical work itself. And we started to see this idea, and the idea is conceptual art, beginning with Dada, which is our first art movement after the end of World War I. The duration for performance art could be a few minutes to a few days, a few months, or even a few years. Performances can be either inside a building or a structure, or they can be outside in nature. Performance art is extraordinarily open-ended, and you'll see that with a lot of the artworks that we're going to look at. It can encompass elements of music, dance, theater, poetry, and video. It's usually performed in front of a live audience, and you have to be careful because sometimes if you're attending, there is no audience. You're asked to participate in the performance. Performance art is usually only done once. The act varies widely between artists, and like earthworks, we rely heavily on photographic documentation of the early works in order to experience and record them. Current performance art is all captured on video. The very first performances, those are called happenings. And I want to read you a little bit about what Alan Kaprow calls a happening. And the first happenings begin in 1959. So Alan Kaprow says, a happening, unlike a stage play, may occur at a supermarket, driving along a highway, under a pile of rags, or in a friend's kitchen, either at once or sequentially. If sequentially, time may extend more than a year. The happening is performed according to a plan, but without rehearsal, without audience, or repetition. It is art, but it seems closer to life. Now, the very first happenings occurred just across the street from NYU at the Judson Memorial Church. And the first happening is called 18 Happenings in 6 parts. You have this room that is divided up into 3 smaller rooms by use of this plastic. That's one of Alan Kaprow's paintings on the wall there. That Alan Kaprow was an abstract expressionist painter. And what would happen is you would have 3 events going on simultaneously. The beginning and ending of the events would be signaled by a bell. And then everyone would change in terms of location and the event that was happening. So you can imagine with also this thin plastic, you can kind of see into the other rooms, all the people moving in and out of these rooms. It was probably really an exciting and noisy time. So we're going to look at Household, which is probably the first famous happening. And it begins in 1964 at a dump in Ithaca, New York. And you just had people show up in the morning, and they would separate out by gender. The women on one side set to building a nest, and the men on the other side of the dump began building a tower. Then we had a car that was pushed out between them, covered in strawberry jam, and the women would start to eat the strawberry jam while the men were destroying the nest that they had just built. Then the men would start eating the strawberry jam while the women were destroying the tower the men had built. And then the car was destroyed and set on fire, and that ended the performance. And this is what I talk about in terms of it is a conceptual activity, that unless we're really told what the meaning of this work is, we're just left kind of at awe, like, what the heck did we just see? And so Alan Kaprow, in regards to this work, says it really is all about the differences between the sexes and how we're never really going to get along. Other performance artists would be like Carolee Schneemann, where she is tossing dead fish and chickens into human bodies, letting us know that the bodies of animals are exactly the same as the bodies of humans. Among the most famous performance artists of the 1970s is Vito Acconci. And among his most famed works is Trademarks, where he would sit nude in a room and try to bite his arms and his legs with such intensity that it would actually leave marks and indentations. He would then ink those indentations, and he would put a piece of paper on top of that, and he would create a print. And this is exactly what the intaglio process is about that we learned earlier on in the semester, the idea of printing from negative space. Some of his other works include the step piece, where you would personally be invited over to his apartment in New York City, and you would watch him do this every single morning at a particular time. And he would do this for the entire month, and you can see with the chalk at the right how long that he would be able to step up and down from this stool. And early on, it was 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. By the end of the month, he had been able to build up enough stamina to do this for 23 minutes before having to stop. He would take a month off, and then he would repeat the exercise, take 2 months off, repeat, and then take 3 months off and repeat. And by the time we get to that 3-month gap, we see that all the previous training has really disappeared. In following piece, he picks a random person and follows them. Here he's playing catch blindfolded. So you can see a huge or a wide variety of different types of performances just by one individual artist. Other famous artists from the 1970s would include Adrian Piper, and she was based in New York. Ana Mendieta, who was from Cuba and eventually moved to New York. She definitely uses her body's form as the basis for performance. But probably my all-time favorite performance artist is Chris Burden. I was lucky enough to meet him a few years ago, just before his death, and I definitely need to update my slide. But he has passed away, and one of the things I liked about him so much was that he is such a focused artist in terms of ideas and thinking. Just outside his ranch in Sunland, California, he had purchased a meteorite on eBay, which you see hanging there off to the right of this image. And he was amazed that this meteorite weighed the exact same amount as his car did. And so here you have this balance beam set up basically in his yard, showing us that the meteorite and the car weigh nearly the same. He rose to fame with this work here called Shoot. In the image at the left, Chris Burden standing up against the wall, and the person at the right is about to shoot him. The person at the right is one of his friends. He's just back from Vietnam. He was a sharpshooter. And we can see the damage inflicted from the bullet at the right. And Chris Burden did this at his studio in Santa Ana. And he sent out invitations to his friends, letting them know that he would be shot at 7 p.m. on a certain night and that he'd hope to have some good pictures. So I'm going to play for you that video right now.
In Shoot, I'm shot in the upper left-hand arm by a friend of mine with a .22 rifle. The only visuals I have of this piece is a very short film clip, about 8 seconds long. So I'm going to begin the piece with an audio tape that was made during the actual performance. In the audio tape, some of the things to listen for are, do you know where you're going to stand, Bruce? Then later, right before the film clip happens, you'll hear me say, are you ready? Then you'll hear the clicking of the Super 8 camera. Later, after the clip is over, another thing to listen for is the sound of the empty shell dropping on the concrete floor. Okay, so I think we could go right into the audio tape.
Now, I'm also going to have that link for you in the description box as well as on the class website. So with Shoot, what you don't see is that as Chris Burden walks off the camera, he collapses. He's taken to the hospital, and the doctors there summon the police because they think it is a domestic violence incident and his wife was the person who shot him. He couldn't very well say, no, I was just doing an art project. And so what ends up happening with Chris Burden is this work elevates him to increased popularity. I mean, he is noted all over the globe. And all the art newspapers and magazines that print this story about being shot in the name of art actually upset Chris Burden. They piss him off because what happens is that they focus only on the violence that this work depicted. And Chris Burden says this work has nothing at all to do with violence, that the basis for this work was anticipation. The idea of how would you live your life knowing that at 7 o'clock someone was going to shoot you. In Doorway to Heaven, Chris Burden takes 2 live electrical wires and electrocutes himself. In Transfixed, this happens at his home in Venice, California. And what he does is he has 2 of his friends hammer nails through his hands into this Volkswagen Bug. And then they open up the garage door and they push the Volkswagen Bug into the street for 2 minutes. And of course, a crowd gathers around And then after the 2 minutes expires, they push the vehicle back into the garage and close the garage door. And that ended the performance. But I guess one of the reasons I also like Chris Burden's work so much is that he puts so much thought into it, but still things go wrong. In this case, when those nails were hammered through his hands into the metal of the car, the ends of the nail bent, and so his friends could not pull the nails out. And Chris Burden says in an interview that the worst part of this artwork was trying to keep his friends calm and collected to find something to cut those nails off of his hands, because he goes, I couldn't do anything. So another cool work that backfires is called Dead Man. And that takes place on La Cienega Boulevard. And he goes up to a random car, sets out flares, lays down and covers himself up with the tarp. And the idea was that the performance would last until the flares extinguished, and then he would get up, fold up the tarp, and then he would walk down a block and get into his car and drive away, leaving everyone wondering what it is that they just saw. However, here the police showed up and they arrested him. Through the Night Softly is him lying nearly half naked on broken glass and kind of crawling his way through that. I do have some video as well for this, and I'm going to play this directly from the presentation because I don't have a clip of it outside of the presentation. So the sound and the music may be just a little bit off, and this is a performance that he did and that he would then show this on television.
Franco presents Good Vibrations, 22 original hits for the Hollies.
The TV ad piece came out of a long-standing desire to be on television. The more I thought about it, the simplest way seemed to be to purchase a commercial advertising slot. Acting on that, I pulled out the yellow pages and started calling up TV stations to get their rates. I could only afford to purchase a 10-second spot ID. My biggest problem was convincing the station that I was worth bothering with, that I was a legitimate artist. They knew I was a small client, and I knew it too. What you've been watching is the advertisement that actually precedes mine. Well, that was it. You saw how short it was. But to me, the content wasn't so important. It was the idea of being on real TV, which to me means anything you can flip to on a dial. Anything else, cable, educational, video, it's not real TV. I didn't have any illusions that people understood this, that they said, oh, there's Chris Burden and he's doing a performance. But I know it stuck out like a sore thumb, and that I had the satisfaction of knowing that 250,000 people saw it every night, and that it was disturbing to them, that they knew something was amiss. And the ad came on, my ad came on 5 times a week for 4 weeks, right after the 11 o'clock news.
So you heard it in his own statement that he just did this to make people feel uneasy at night, wondering what they were just watching. In Velvet Water, he tries to breathe underwater. It doesn't work. But at the end of the 1970s and early 1980s, he transfers his ideas of performance art into sculpture and becomes one of the most important sculpture artists that we have in the late part of the 20th century. In all the submarines in the USA, we've got these wonderful cardboard toys, and Chris Burden is very big into using kids' toys in his art. Each of these replicas representing one of the submersibles launched by the United States Navy, and this is the 100th anniversary of launching its first submarine. So while this work looks like a very friendly school of fish, something very aesthetically pleasing, we have to realize that these are also very toxic war machines. Chris Burden was also responsible for giving us Metropolis 2, which we saw during the motion lecture, and this is all about this giant Hot Wheels track, a really neat example of kinetic sculpture. In our sculpture lecture, we saw Beam Drop, and he's also responsible for giving us the lights out in front of the LA County Museum of Art. We're going to talk about Marina Abramovic next, and she calls herself the grandmother of performance art. She is still alive, and she runs an art school teaching others how to do performance. Rhythm 10 is pretty disturbing, where she places her hand out on a sheet of paper and then tries to hit the knife in between her fingers. However, of course, she does cut them multiple times, and the artwork itself is the bloodstains that are left over. I will show you a really short video that's similar to this. I do not have the video for the original Rhythm 10. So that's definitely not something I would encourage you to do at home. After Rhythm 10, I want to go to the most current work that she's noted for, called The Artist is Present. And this took place at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And I'm going to show you the video of this as well. And before I forget, there is one more video I'm going to play for you, or I'm going to have the link for you rather, in the description box. And it's also uploaded onto your class website, called Ah. Definitely take some time to watch that as well. It is about a 10-minute video. Maybe watch the first minute or two, fast forward it to the center for another minute, and then at the very end, you do need to watch the last minute and a half of that. But I would not suggest that you watch all 10 minutes of this. So back to The Artist is Present, and I'm going to end with the video of this performance artwork. As I mentioned, it was at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and people lined up like they were getting into Disneyland in the morning outside of that museum. She was there for about 3 months, and you had the opportunity to sit across from her. Now, this is a picture taken very early on because they took the table out during the very first week. So you could sit across from her for as long as you wanted, but you would have always a line of people waiting to sit across from her. It was that popular of an exhibit. The idea that you could stare into each other's eyes. So with that, I'm going to play the video. Don't forget to watch the supporting links, and I will see you at our next chapter.